delay. So the heart pumps about 7,000 liters of blood through the body each day. It contracts more than 2.5 billion times in an average lifetime. It pumps blood through the blood vessels from artery to arterial to capillary, then out to venules, veins, and back to the heart. And the heart and the blood vessels are going to make up this system. That cardiovascular refers to both the heart and the blood vessels. And the pumping action of the heart transports blood through the blood vessels, and it does so in two circuits. The pulmonary circuit that transports oxygen-poor blood from the heart to the lungs and back to the heart, whereas in the lungs, oxygen is picked up and CO2 is released. And the systemic circuit, which transports oxygen-rich blood from the heart to all the body cells and back to the heart. Blood's going to deliver those nutrients to the cells, and at the same time, it's going to pick up any waste along the way. So the left side of the heart contains oxygen-rich blood coming back from the lungs and going to the body, while the right side contains oxygen-poor blood, either coming back from the body or on its way to the lungs. Two separate circuits. You can think of the heart as two side-by-side pumps. It is a hollow cone-shaped muscular pump. It's actually, again, two pumps side by side. It's in the mediastinum of the thoracic cavity above the diaphragm, and it has four chambers, two upper chambers called atria, and two lower chambers called ventricles. And those ventricles deliver the blood either to the lungs or to the entire body, whereas the upper chambers receive the blood either from the lungs or the body and deliver that blood to the ventricles. The heart size is going to vary with your body size. Again, it's in the thoracic cavity. The average is 14 centimeters long, 9 centimeters wide. Again, it is posterior to the sternum, behind the sternum, medial to each of the lungs, anterior, so in front of the vertebral column. Its base is around the second rib, and the apex is around the space between the fifth rib, the intercostal space, as shown here. It's covered with a pericardium. There is a fibrous outer layer that surrounds the double-layered serous membrane. The parietal pericardium is deep to that fibrous pericardium, and it is, but still outside the heart itself. It's the outer layer of the serous membrane, while the inner layer is the visceral pericardium. It's attached to the surface of the heart, and it is also referred to as the epicardium. Their heart wall has three distinct layers: the epicardium, the myocardium, and the endocardium. Epicardium is the outermost layer. It's also called the visceral pericardium. It is a very thin layer. The muscular layer, the myocardium, is the middle layer. It's cardiac muscle tissue. It's the thickest layer. It's the functional layer. While the endocardium is the inner layer, it forms a lining of all the heart chambers. It's also a very thin layer, and that endocardium is going to be continuous with the lining of the blood vessels that it's attached to. I won't go into much detail in this this chart as you have it in your book, and I suggest you refer to table 15.1 when you want questions about walls of the heart. Heart's divided into four chambers, again, two atria, two ventricles. The atria are thin-walled upper chambers that receive blood returning to the heart. And they have structures called auricles on them that are flap-like projections that allow expansion of the atria. The ventricles are the thick-walled lower chambers that pump blood into the arteries. The right atrium is going to receive blood returning from the systemic circuit, from the superior and inferior vena cava and coronary sinus, and it will pump its blood to the right ventricle. The right ventricle, receiving blood from the right atrium, sends that blood to the lungs. The left atrium is going to receive blood from the pulmonary vein and pump the blood to the left ventricle. The left ventricle is going to receive blood from the left atrium and pump the blood to the systemic circuit. There are valves between these structures. The tricuspid valve is the right atrioventricular valve. It's between the right atrium and the right ventricle. And its purpose is to prevent blood from moving backwards, so that as you can, when you squeeze that right ventricle, blood doesn't go back into the atrium. It makes its way to the lungs. The pulmonary valve is found at the entrance to the pulmonary trunk, and that prevents blood from moving from the pulmonary trunk back into the right ventricle as it relaxes. The mitral valve is the left atrioventricular valve between the atrium and the ventricle, and it again prevents blood from going from the left ventricle back into the left atrium. And the aortic valve is found at the entrance to the aorta, and it prevents blood from moving from the aorta back into the left ventricle during relaxation. Those are all shown here, and you will have a chance to dissect a heart on Thursday of this week. There's a rigid rings of dense connective tissue that surround the origins of the pulmonary trunk and the aorta. There are orifices between the atria and the ventricles. These provide a kind of skeleton-like network for the heart. They provide attachments for heart valves and muscle fibers, preventing excess dilation during contraction. And those rings, along with other fibrous masses, make up the interventricular septum, which we collectively refer to as the skeleton of the heart. So blood from the systemic circuit is going to flow into the vena cava and coronary sinus, which will dump into the right atrium, passing through the tricuspid valve to the right ventricle, passing through the pulmonary valve to the pulmonary trunk, which makes its way to the pulmonary arteries, then pulmonary capillaries, pulmonary veins, the left atrium through the mitral valve, which is a bicuspid valve, and into the left ventricle and out into the body, passing through the aortic valve to the aorta and to the entire body. The heart supplies blood to itself. The blood within the heart is not nurturing blood tissue. There is a circulatory system for the heart itself. The left and right coronary arteries supply blood to the heart tissues, and they are the first that branch off the aorta. So from the aorta, we go to the right coronary artery or the left coronary artery. And there are circulations involving each of those until the blood returns back to the venous return from the coronary sinus. So one cardiac cycle is the events of a heartbeat. The heart chambers will function in a coordinated manner. Heart action is regulated so that the atria contract, which is known as atrial systole, and the ventricles at the same time are relaxing, ventricular diastole. Then the ventricles will contract, ventricular systole, while the atrials relax. So the cardiac cycle, a heartbeat, is a very coordinated event. Replacing the heart from transplants to stem cell implants. So a heart transplant is the replacement of most or all of a failing heart with a donor heart. That involves solid organ transplantation and all of the pitfalls associated with solid organ transplantation. However, it also gives you all the advantages of solid organ transplantation. It is also possible to install a left ventricular assisted device, which is a mechanical device used to help the heart pump better and deliver blood. And it's usually a stopgap mechanism until a donor heart is available. There is a lot of work being done on artificial hearts, so an implantable replacement heart. The first artificial hearts were external devices. These now use things like titanium and plastic. Can't have a heart transplant, don't have long to live. short-term benefits, but still in study. And stem cells still promise a very bright future. We haven't got to the heart, haven't got to the point where stem cells are showing clinical effectiveness yet, but we are close. So that cardiac cycle, it begins with, we can begin it anywhere, but we'll start with the atrial systole and ventricular diastole. In this point, the ventricles are relaxed, the AV valves open, and the semilunar valves close. About 70% of the blood is not really being pumped. It's flowing passively from atria to ventricles. And then that last bit of push for the atrial systole pushes the other 30% into the ventricles, and that causes pressure within the ventricles to increase. Now, during the process of ventricular systole and atrial diastole, the AV valves are closed. The chordae tendineae prevent the cusp of the valve from bulging too far backward into the atria. Atria relax. The blood flows in the atria from the vena cava, from the pulmonary veins. Ventricle pressure increases as that opens the semilunar valves, and the blood will flow into the pulmonary trunk and the aorta. There are some heart sounds that you will learn clinically. I will talk about them here, but you need to know in all of this cardiac stuff, I'm telling you a non-clinician's point of view of heart physiology and anatomy, not how to diagnose nor treat heart disease. So the heart sounds are typically referred to as a lub-dup, and they are due to the closing of heart valves. So that lub is the first heart sound. It occurs during ventricular systole, and it has to do with the AV valves closing, the atrioventricular valves. The dup sound is the second heart sound, and it occurs during ventricular diastole. It's associated with closing of the pulmonary and aortic semilunar valves. When there are other sounds or abnormal sounds, those are referred to as murmurs, and some of them, many of them, are associated with problems with those valves, maybe incomplete closing. So clinically, the areas you would check with your stethoscope would include the aortic area, the pulmonary area, the mitral area, and the tricuspid area. Cardiac muscle cells form a branching network. They are similar to skeletal muscle cells, but not exactly the same. There are a number of important differences. They have between them structures called intercalated discs or gap junctions, so that they are each cell's cytoplasm is in direct communication with the other cells, and that makes the heart act not like a bunch of single cells, but more like a coordinated large cell. It is a functional syncytium. The atrial walls have the atrial syncytium, while the ventricle walls have the ventricular syncytium. The conduction system are groups of cells that spontaneously depolarize and distribute impulses throughout the myocardium, and they are used to coordinate the events of the cardiac cycle. We would start with the SA node, which is sinoatrial, to the atrial syncytium, the junctional fibers, the AV node, the AV bundle, bundle branches, Purkinje fibers, then the ventricular syncytium. So that sinoatrial node is the pacemaker, initiates the rhythmic contractions of the heart. The internodal atrial muscle conducts impulses from the SA node to the atria. The junctional fibers conduct impulses from the SA node to the AV node, while the atrioventricular or AV node conducts impulses to the AV bundle. That involves a delay that allows the atria to finish contracting before the ventricles contract. The atrioventricular bundle, traditionally referred to as the bundle of His, conducts the impulses rapidly between the SA node and the bundle branches. The bundle branches are left and right. They split off from the AV bundle, conducting impulses to the Purkinje fibers on both sides of the heart, and those Purkinje fibers conduct the impulses to the ventricular myocardium, so that The contraction begins at the apex of the heart and moves upward toward, for the ventricles, toward the atrium. So again, I won't walk you through this figure as you have it in your book, but you should, on your own, walk through it and track these SA nodes to AV node, to bundle branches, to Purkinje fibers. An electrocardiogram, ECG, or more commonly EKG, is a recording of electrical changes that occur in the myocardium during the cardiac cycle. It can be used clinically to assess the heart's ability to conduct impulses. Again, I am not a clinician. I'm going to go through this in a very lab-oriented explanation of the physiology of electrocardiograms. But eventually, many of you as nurses will learn to read electrocardiograms, and you may not need all the details I'm going to give you to know how to read them, but it can't hurt. So the changes in the ECG waves or EKG waves are a P wave, a QRS complex, and a T wave. The P wave is associated with atrial depolarization, and it occurs just prior to contraction of the atrium. The QRS complex is actually three waves that kind of overlap with each other. That is related to ventricular depolarization and occurs just prior to ventricular contraction. And the T wave is the ventricular repolarization, and it occurs just prior to ventricular relaxation. The recording of atrial repolarization is kind of lost in that QRS wave since it's a much larger electrical event, but just in case you were wondering why we don't have one. So here's figure 15.9 showing what appears to be a normal EKG. You can see the delay, then the P wave, followed by the QRS wave, and that followed up with a delay by the T wave. So that's a repeating P, QRS, T, P, QRS, T. And that's what you would expect to have. And if you look over here on this side, you see what's going on in the heart itself. Here the atria are filling. Here they are putting it into the ventricles and pumping it out. And we can do the same thing with a slightly different figure and align it with the heart sounds. That SA node normally controls the heart rate. That's a sinus rhythm you might hear on TV sometimes. It's involving sympathetic and parasympathetic fibers that modify the heart rate in response to changing conditions, such as if you were physically exercising and your body temperature was changing, a fight and flight response, as well as concentration of ions. The parasympathetic impulses come through the vagus nerve to decrease heart rate, and sympathetic impulses tend to accelerate the heart rate. There are also baroreceptors that detect pressure from the cardiac control center in the medulla oblongata, and that helps to balance the inhibitory and excitatory effects of parasympathetic and sympathetic fibers. And that region of the brain regulates the autonomic impulses to the heart, but there is its own intrinsic electrical system, the SA node, through Purkinje fibers. So those baroreceptor reflexes will detect changes in blood pressure and attempt to modify the heartbeat to protect against those changes in blood pressure, rapid changes in blood pressure. So if we talk about EKGs, we've got to talk about arrhythmias. They are altered heart rhythms. They can come in several types. I'm not going to go into details of how to read them, but these are the kinds of things you will once you know how to read an EKG. Not diagnose because you're nurses, but to detect. So fibrillation is an uncoordinated, chaotic contraction within small areas of the myocardium. If it's atrial fibrillation, it may not be life-threatening. It can be a risk factor for strokes. Ventricular fibrillation, on the other hand, is often fatal because you don't get a coordinated delivery of blood to the body. Tachycardia is abnormally fast. That defined clinically as 100 beats per minute if you are resting. Bradycardia is a slow, 60 beats per minute at rest. Premature beat is a beat that occurs before the expected in a normal cardiac cycle, and it often comes from ectopic regions of the heart, so regions other than the SA node beginning the process. An ectopic pacemaker is damage to the SA node that has the AV node often taking over, acting as a secondary pacemaker, and that can change the heart rate from 40 to 60 beats per minute instead of 70 to 80 beats per minute. And that can be treated with an artificial pacemaker, which is implanted, battery operated, and sends signals when they are appropriate. All right, I'm going to stop there. That's a lot of information, but at least it's broken down.